afternoon, good evening, excuse me, to all of our family joining from across Turtle Island, otherwise known as North America, Palestine, and the world. Welcome to a virtual discussion honoring Palestinian fathers, hosted by the Palestinian Feminist Collective. The PFC is a body of Palestinian and Arab feminists located on Turtle Island who are committed to achieving Palestinian social and political liberation by confronting systematic gendered, sexual, and colonial violence, oppression, and dispossession. We are an intergenerational collective of activists, organizers, practitioners, creators, thinkers, artists, scholars, healers, water and land protectors, life givers, and life sustainers. Through an anti-collective colonial approach, we center the political urgency of the Palestinian struggle. We resist the normalization of Zionist violence, oppression, and hegemony in all aspects of our public and private life, including within feminist spaces. Our decolonial work centers a set of life-affirming principles and practices to redefine movement cultures that are rooted in transformative justice, healing, and creation. We are inspired by and borrow from past and present Palestinian, Arab, Black, Indigenous, and Third World feminist movements, thought, and practice. We advance Palestinian feminism as a liberatory philosophy and practice necessary to create the world we want to live in. You can learn more about the PFC and our work by visiting the Palestinian Feminist Collective.org and following us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. My name is Bayan Abusnene, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at The Ohio State University. I'm a member of the PFC and honored to introduce today's event with you all. As a part of Palestinian Feminist Collective's Feminist Future Calendar, today's virtual event will be to create space, honor, and recognize the complex lived experiences and realities of Palestinian fathers. We're welcomed by two incredible speakers. Raja Shehadeh, author of the memoir, We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I, and Abeer Otman, postdoctoral scholar who will unpack how Zionist settler colonialism impinges on Palestinian fatherhood, as well as how fathers defy settler colonialism by showing love, care, and protection for their families and for their homes. As Palestinian feminists, we will conceptualize what are the experiences of Palestinian fathers, diverse and complicated. How do we tell these stories of fatherhood, and how can we continue to hold them and make space for them in our pursuit of Palestinian liberation? Before we get started, we want to take a moment to thank not only all of you for joining us this weekend, but to our co-sponsors, without whom this event would not have been possible. Our partnering organizations today include the Palestinian American Community Center, the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and the American Muslims for Palestine. Today's event is curated as part of the Palestinian Feminist Collective's 2023 Palestinian Feminist Futures Calendar and Program. Launched in December of 2022, the PFC Futures Calendar serves as an embodied feminist grammar and poetics of land, life, love, and liberation. In the calendar, we mark resistance, feminist political, and mourning anniversaries in Palestinian history, and draw out crucial lessons from our ancestors, elders, movements, land, and traditions. Some of these anniversaries inform the cultivation of our 13 principles for a Palestinian feminist future. Looking to our history to cultivate our principles is a practice that reminds us that the past and present are tethered to one another and are central to making a liberated future. Featuring the artwork of 15 Palestinian women artists, tributes to 50 Palestinian women across generations and geographies, and a chronology of Palestinian feminist organizations from 1893 to 2020. The calendar represents a continuity of Palestinian time, land, and people, wherever we may reside. Centering creativity, the calendar illustrates how art and culture remain enduring vehicles for Palestinian expression and hold restorative power towards the recreation of life and resistance beyond ruin. You may find some of our calendar contents at the link provided in the chat box. So each month, the PFC hosts an activity which honors a specific anniversary in Palestinian history and our aligned feminist future, principal, and featured artist. This month, we are proud to honor Palestinian Father's Day with our featured artist, Manal Deeb, with her beautiful piece titled Findings, which is on the screen. Manal Deeb is a Palestinian-American visual artist born in Ramallah and living in Fairfax, Virginia. Manal studied studio art at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and received her bachelor's degree in interdisciplinary studies of the psychology of art from George Mason University. In her work, Manal presents exceptional and creative works that challenge her surroundings as thought-provoking metaphors. Her work has been exhibited all over the world, from Venice to New York, from Boston to Los Angeles, to Doha, Delhi, and Rome. Her mission and main subjects are humanity, feminism, peace, equality, Palestine, Arab women, identity, and the bridging of religious divides. We also wanted to take a moment to read our principle for this month. So we hold space for Palestinian fathers who fight life and limb to create a safe and loving world for their children, excuse me. We empathetically care for them, for their material losses and broken hearts, just as we value and nurture practices of Palestinian fatherhoods that center care, feelings, love, and vulnerability. We acknowledge the immeasurable sacrifices and hardships our fathers experience, caused by Zionism, and the relentless hope and courage they continue to foster within us. Our feminist vision advocates for breaking intimate and state cycles of violence by centering and transforming home and family space into sites of healing and mending. So I'll now turn to introducing our speakers, and this will be in the order that they will be speaking. Ustad Raja Shehadeh is a Palestinian lawyer, human rights activist, and writer. He co-founded the Palestinian human rights organization Al-Haq in 1979. He is the author of several books, including Palestinian Walks, which he won the Orwell Prize in 2008. In addition to his legal work, he has written a number of books about Palestine through the lens of his life, including Strangers in the House in 2002, Occupation Diaries in 2012, and his latest, We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I, a Palestinian Memoir, 2022. Dr. Abeer Otman is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Researching and Embedding Human Rights, Department of Psychosocial Studies, Birkbeck, University of London, and a postdoctoral fellow at the Faculty of Law at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Abeer has a doctorate in social work from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her doctoral research focused on fathers and fatherhood in a settler colonial context, the case of the occupied East Jerusalem. Her research interests include fatherhood, father-child connectivities, trauma and suffering, secrecy and surveillance, livability, hope, futurity, and higher education. She holds a master's degree in social work from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her experience in studying the occupied East Jerusalem community includes researching child arrests, women's access to justice, and the socioeconomic impacts of the annexation walls with local NGOs and the United Nations. Now, please help me welcome Iman Ghanayem, a member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective and one of the co-organizers of this event, who will be opening the event with a few short remarks. Thank you.
Marhaba, hi everyone. Thank you so much, Bayan. We are truly honored and excited to be holding a place for this very important conversation today on fathers and fatherhood in the context of Palestine's colonization and the complexity and continuous entanglements or struggle. To complement Bayan's English introduction of the Palestinian Feminist Collective's Feminist Futures Calendar Principle on Father's Day, I would like to read through the Arabic translation. عيد الأب الفلسطيني. نقدر مجهود الأب الفلسطيني لما يبذله من عطاء ونضال لتوفير حياة آمنة ومفعمة بالحب لأطفاله. نحزن لقلوبهم المكسورة وخسائرهم الحياتية والمادية. كما نقدر ونشجع الممارسات الأبوية التي تركز على الحب والاهتمام والرقة. إننا نشهد على التضحيات الأبوية التي لا حدود لها والمصاعب التي يتعرض لها آباؤنا بسبب الاحتلال الصهيوني، كما وأننا نقدر الأمل والشجاعة التي يواصلون في تعزيزها في داخلنا على الرغم من كل ما يواجهونه. تدعو رؤيتنا النسوية إلى حماية الحياة العائلية وكسر أنماط العنف الداخلي والخارجي من خلال تحويل البيت والأسرة إلى موقع للشفاء والصلاح المجتمعي. When we, Bayan, Abeer, and I envisioned this event, we were cognizant of the fact that our relationship to our fathers is not always an easy one. It can be complicated, it can be stressful, it can be sad, it can be hard, even when joyful things exist within its space. My own personal investment in this event was in relation to my recent loss of my father, who died in April 2022 due to COVID-related health complications. My father passed away in his home village in Sorif in Palestine, or Palestine. He was surrounded by all his loved ones except myself, at least not in person. In fact, also due to COVID complications and a messy visa situation, the last time I had seen him alive was in 2019. Since his death, I've reflected a lot on our relationship. It was not an easy or simple or an always happy relationship, but grief here was a catalyst. Grief was an opportunity to make it simple and easy and happy. He was no longer in a colonized place or a lonely place or an angry place. His death meant a new level of freedom that we, my siblings, my mother, and I chose to believe to be true. Our honored guests today speak about grief. They tell stories after the fact of death or within its constant presence in Palestine. I invite our audience to find connections in Ustad Raja's and Dr. Abeer's contributions. I also invite them to share their own stories during the Q&A portion at the end of our event. We also plan to stop the recording then, so you can feel more comfortable. More importantly, I invite all of us as Palestinians to ask, how can we begin to honor our fathers without death as our catalyst? How can we become better fathers? How can we become better children? Our cultural practice and stories of constantly remembering and honoring and showing respect for the decolonial. I would like to give the floor to Ustaz Raja, who will be reading from his latest book, We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I. I have my copy here. If you haven't done so already, please buy it and read it. It's an incredible memoir. Please, Ustaz Raja, تفضل.
Shukran. As I'm sure Abeer will tell us more, there are many different ways of dealing with the trauma of the Nakba. And different people deal differently with the Nakba. My father in particular was never one to speak a lot about the Nakba. He was one to be actively trying to do something about the effects of the Nakba. I came to know my father much better and get closer to him through the writing of this book, We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I. So for example, on page 9, for those who have the book, I wrote, many years later, I have come to realize that the emotions I was experiencing as a result of Israel's transformation of our world must have been similar to those that my father had experienced after 1948. He witnessed the division of the Palestine he knew between Israel and Jordan after he was forced to leave his home and law office in Jaffa and settle in Ramallah, which came to be under Jordanian rule. It must have felt just as incredible to him that this change could happen and prove to be permanent as the changes that I was witnessing under Israeli law seemed to me. And yet we never spoke about this, and nor did the similarities in our experiences bring us closer together. And this is a theme that I explore in the book. Why is it that I did not feel during my father's lifetime able to understand and talk to him about his experiences and make us closer together? So just to give you an idea about my father, I'm reading from page 11. My father was 73 when he was killed. 2 years later, 2 years older than I am now. But the man of 34 I was then he seemed to be very old, someone to whom I could not relate. I remember once when I had quarreled with my father, how my uncle Fuad drew me into his room at the office. He had seen how I was going against my father with all the vigor of youth, and he asked me to slow down. Take it easy on your father, he said. Remember, he is 70 years old. Yet, this meant nothing to me. I didn't want to make any allowances for his age because I did not understand what age does to a man and was too full of myself to even try. For years, I lived as a son whose world was ruled by a fundamentally benevolent father with whom I was temporarily fighting. I was sure that we were moving, always moving, towards the ultimate happy family, and that one day we would all live in harmony. When he died, before this could happen, I had to wake up from my fantasy, had to face the godlessness of my world and the fact that it is time-bound. There was not enough time for the rebellion and the dream. The rebellion had consumed all the available time. I turned around to ask my stage manager when the second act would start and found that there was none. I was alone. There was no second act and no stage manager. What hadn't happened in the first act would never happen. Life moves in real time. But then I was in my prime, going full speed ahead with my human rights work, thinking the world of myself. Having been a slow developer, I was beginning to feel able at long last to realize my potential and experience the young manhood that had been interrupted by the start of the Israeli occupation in 1967. I did not want anyone deterring me, stopping me in my tracks, or casting doubt on the work I was so enthusiastically engaged in. I felt I was forging ahead, breaking what I believed then was new ground in the kind of legal resistance I was involved with against Israeli actions. I had no idea that my father had done the same years earlier, nor did I know that it was from him that I got my public spirit and the sense of responsibility that made me regard the failures of my people as a personal flaw for which I must bear the blame. It was this that motivated so many of my legal investigations into how Israel was pursuing its policies in the occupied territories, and that pushed me to write all those articles and books to explain, to document, to advocate. I would like to read to you how my father reacted when we went and visited Jaffa for the first time after 1967. I remember the day when several months after the occupation, we drove south to Jaffa to look for the land my father had bought before the Nakba. I remember how quiet and somber he was on the way. At first, he seemed a bit confused about the exact location of the plot, but it didn't take long before he found it. It was vacant, as though awaiting his return. From the car, he pointed it out to us. Then, without saying a word, he left the vehicle. The land lay on a promontory overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. He walked to it. He didn't invite us to go with him, nor did we think of joining him. His silence was heavy and seemed to weigh him down. We left him on his own. We saw him stop, raise his hand, and look at the sea. He didn't stay long, and when he returned, he was still wrapped in silence. He didn't utter a single word or betray any emotion. We also remained silent, not daring to say a word about the land, how lovely it was. We sensed that to sing its praises so close to the sea that we so often yearned to live by would have only rubbed salt into his deep wound. As I recall this incident, I wonder now what my father's thoughts were and why he did not share them. Was it rage or embarrassment that he felt? I suspect it was more likely shame at how badly his generation had failed, losing their land to Israel and never achieving the return that he had worked so hard to realize. Expressing rage or regret would have humiliated him. So he kept his thoughts to himself and drew us back to Ramallah in silence. My father was an activist who who struggled all his life against oppression. He was active in attempts at return of the refugees to their homes after 1948. And for 5 years, he worked hard on this in various ways that I describe in the book. And then after, in 1954, he took a case against Israel for the blocked accounts when Israel was attempting to block the accounts and refuse to allow the Palestinians who were outside to draw on the money from the banks, that the branches of the bank, Arab Bank and Barclays Bank that were in Israel. And he succeeded in unblocking the accounts, and the Palestinians got back their money. But after that, he went to London and in order to work out details of return of the money to its own owners, and he was not allowed to return to Ramallah. And he stayed in exile for 2.5 years. And then after his return, he was involved in the case of the free officers, and then he was taken into a prison, in desert prison in Jaffa. And that was a very harsh experience, and I write about it here after he was released from prison. I say, and that's what page 127. I don't remember my father's return from Jaffa. Jaffa is the prison where he was kept incarcerated, the desert prison. I have a memory of seeing a photograph of him with a dark growth of beard covering his face, a shaved head, and large, fiery, dark brown eyes. Was this taken at the desert prison and smuggled out, or was it a false memory, a trick of the imagination? Yet he must have had a long beard, although I don't recall him with one. My sister told me that he was whisked away, probably by my mother, as soon as he arrived home, and rushed off to the barber's for a shave, so that we would not see him bearded. But I have no memory of that either. How is it that I remember none of this? How is it that his unjust imprisonment under such harsh conditions didn't make my father a hero in my eyes? Why have I never looked at him or up to him or appreciated what he endured? I accept now the unsettling realization that my attitude towards my father was never one of admiration. I made no effort to ask him about his prison experience or to understand the political battles he fought. I took my mother's side and thought, like her, that he was too rash and foolish to get engaged in activities that ultimately led him into trouble. In other words, I blamed the victim, whether for his banishment from the country, his stay in Jaffa, or his failure in his political endeavors, which always seemed to go stubbornly against the trend and result in him becoming more and more unpopular and mistrusted. Without proper awareness of the reasons behind his actions, none of their consequences gave me cause to admire my father for his heroism in resisting the regime and tolerating harsh prison conditions in the merciless desert prison. I had scant understanding of why he was putting himself in danger. Even later, when I wrote about him in my memoirs, it frequently was from my mother's point of view. She supplied the standard against which I gauged his worth. I knew very little of his history. He made nothing of his struggle for the reparations of the Palestinian refugees or against the perfidious regime in Jordan. What I heard much more was my mother's efforts on his behalf as she shuttled between various Jordanian officials pleading for his release. It was she who won my sympathy for the hardships I believed my father had inflicted on her. I had a vague notion that Jordan had conspired with Israel to usurp Palestine, but knew nothing of the details or of my father's valiant attempts at combating all of this, for which he paid such a heavy price. I was caught up in the family drama, which colored my understanding of the situation. I did not have my own thoughts on any of this, but was influenced by my mother and her mistrust of politics, as well as her critical, disapproving attitude towards my father's activism. This created a huge gulf between us. I had my own immature ideas based on sentimental Hollywood dramas of how it should be between father and son, and made no effort to understand my father on his own terms. Now that I know now I know how much we have in common. What I regret most of all is the fact that we have not been much of friends. Naturally, like most women with daring husbands who subject themselves to danger, my mother did not want her son to follow suit. So she tried to raise me in such a way that I would stay away from danger and concentrate on adventures of the mind. She enriched my imagination with her enthralling storytelling, unknowingly guiding me towards the writer I have become. She neither acknowledged nor spoke of my father's heroic deeds or tried to inspire me to follow in his footsteps. But in the end, I didn't listen to her either. For many years, I dedicated myself to public service and got involved in human rights activism, and much to my mother's dismay. There's another interesting detail that my father, when he wrote some of his articles, he signed his name as Samid. While looking over father's papers, I came upon a brief, undated statement, presumably written shortly after the commencement of the Israeli occupation. It was headed, "Speech is prohibited," and in it he wrote the following: "In the course of the mandate, we were prohibited from speaking out, but that was no surprise because the terms of the mandate were to prepare for the political, administrative, and economic conditions for the establishment of a home for the Jews. Then came Jordan's rule with promises of change and for allowing freedom of speech. But once we opened our mouths, arrests began, military rule ensued, and political parties were banned. Again, we said it is no surprise, for this is the nature of every occupation. Then came the Israeli occupation that prohibited political parties and rallies, and we said once more, this is the nature of every occupation. On top of all of this, now we have orders issued from abroad denying those under occupation the right to speak and give their opinions. By God, how can there be honorable living when the right to think and speak is denied?" This is what he wrote. Now I wrote, clearly he had had enough of being forcibly silenced and was going to assert his freedom and his right to speak without fear of the consequences, and he wasted no time. The curious thing was that he signed the statement Samid, the one who perseveres. This was 12 years before I began adding that very same signature to letters I later compiled in a book that I called The Third Way. I was totally unaware that my father had used the very same pen name. Yet, when the book was published and he read it, he never mentioned the piece he had written or remarked on the coincidence that he had chosen the same name that he had used years earlier. But why? Was it because to be a Samid had become too passive for him and no longer a viable strategy for overcoming the conditions we were suffering? Or was it because he did not want to deprive me of the pleasure of finding my own voice? Maybe by then he had already moved to the political activism he believed was necessary in order to confront our situation. So he was putting all his energies into trying to establish a Palestinian state. The interesting thing is he never told me that we use the same pen name. Again, when he was disbarred and his name was struck out from the list of lawyers in Jordan, again, I learned about this from, this is on page 138. I learned about this from a friend at the summer work camp in Ramallah. "Did you see the paper?" he whispered to me. I told him I hadn't. "It says that your father will no longer be able to practice law." By this time, I was 17 years old, and though it saddened me and disturbed me to hear this, I kept this information to myself. I did not speak to my father about it or ask about him what he was going to do in response. It was only 50 years later that I found out from his papers how he reacted. He wrote to his colleague and former partner in Jaffa, Ilyas Nasser, who was now in Amman, asking that he and others submit an appeal on his behalf against the bar's decision, of which he had not been notified, to Jordan's High Court of Justice. He directed them to base the appeal on the regulations of the Lawyers' Union, pointing out the specific articles to be invoked and arguments to be made. My father never showed me this letter or mentioned it to me. As always, he kept me at a distance. Perhaps he thought I was too interested, I was not interested, or that in this way he would be protecting me. He remained to the end of his life on the blacklist of those banned from practicing law in Jordan. I will read now from the end of the book. The working title of the book was, Are You Listening? Before I changed it into, we could have been friends, my father and I. This is from the end of the book, from page 148. I now fully appreciate that throughout his life, my father sought the admirable objective of peace with our enemies, and in that he never wavered. In his last years, he often repeated the warning that if we didn't come to terms with Israel, then it would only get more difficult as new Israeli generations came up who had a different outlook and were brought up to hate the Arabs. But he wasn't listened to. He continued to encounter extremely difficult challenges, yet he managed to survive them and live his life to the fullest. My own contributions and difficulties are nothing in comparison. As to our own relationship, I finally see how often he made attempts to bring me closer to him, how often in the course of our life together, he tried to get me to listen, but I couldn't or wouldn't because I was angry, and that unpopularity of his politics was making it difficult for me to belong, or so I thought for a long time. Now I realize, to my eternal regret, that the main reason why the love between us remained unacknowledged was me. I was the one who was unwilling. I can almost hear my father asking, "Are you listening now?" To which I answer, "Yes, now I am." I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ustad Raja. And I want to encourage folks to get a copy of the book. It's written in such a intimate and personal way. So I'm excited to hopefully talk more about it in the Q&A. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Abeer Otman. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Bayan. Thank you, Ustad Raja. I think our talks have so much in common. Okay, I want to do a share screen. Is that possible?
You should be.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Great. I want to start with Abu Nasser from Jabal Mukabbir, a neighborhood in East Jerusalem. During that moment in the courtroom, when my son was sentenced for 7 years, I felt so much pain. I wanted to collapse because he is still a kid. But I had to be strong for his mother and his sisters. I deceived my feelings, I hide them. But if you look deep in my face, if you observe its details, you would know that I was broken because I am a father, I'm a human, I'm a cluster of feelings and affects. Abu Fadi from Ras Al Amoud, here in occupied East Jerusalem, we live under constant attack. I want my children to understand the occupation, so they won't be shocked when they are older and facing the violence it produces. I took them with me to the Eid prayers in Al-Aqsa Mosque, as we always do. Although I knew that the soldiers would attack us while we prayed, I was so afraid. My children were terrified. I hugged them and I told them, "Don't be afraid, Yaba. You are with me." I was nervous and anxious, but I also felt stronger because they were with me. Many people criticized me for doing this. They don't understand the burden of raising a child under occupation. Listening to fathers' narrations of the complexity of fathering under a colonial machinery of death and dispossession raises the questions of how is fatherhood framed by fathers faced with political trauma. How do they cope, deal, and face major hardships? And what are the psychosocial dynamics and modes of coping that fathers experience in the occupied East Jerusalem context? And how do we, researchers, hear fathers' stories? How do we write what they want us to convey? How to reflect what that they try to do all it takes to father while dispossessed and in pain? Abu Nasser's and Abu Fad's voices teach us that we misread and misinterpret their actions, affects, challenges, and realities. Indeed, after years of practicing community social work in occupied East Jerusalem and studying women, children, and families in East Jerusalem socio-political context, I became aware of our lack of knowledge about fathers and our marginalizations of fathers and fatherhood in our research, theory, and practice. My observations of social work practice and interventions during ongoing political violence revealed a lack of outreach to fathers and the use of narrow understandings and methods in working with them. Sayegh argues that silencing is itself a cause of suffering and deepens the pain and loss, as those who suffer more intensely from the acknowledgement of their pain. Then the examination of many studies that mention Palestinian fathers reveals that fathers are mentioned mostly in relation to patriarchy, domestic and gender violence, studies on children, youth, and family, while dismissing them when focusing on care, love, protection, loss, and trauma. Palestinian researchers and therapists have been looking for years at mothers, but fathers were absent from their analysis. Feminist scholars and therapists who center and examine the margins have internalized a dominant legacy of gender studies and interventions by investing in mothers while marginalizing fathers. Maybe we fear male dominance or being exposed to male pain to a degree that fathers and their traumas have been excluded. Scholars' observations of mothers show that there is a multiplicity of motherhood, but they overlook the multiplicity of fatherhood. This is so even though we witness various struggles and reaching out in public on social media, indicating that in dismissing fathers and excluding their reaching out, we as scholars, therapists, and practitioners replicate structural conditions that generate marginalization. To overcome fathers' marginalization and the gap in the knowledge about their fatherhood, I choose to use feminist analysis of power, domination, and affects in order to recognize the importance of their lived experience of everyday life with the goal of unwreathing subjective knowledge. Feminist thinking and practice require thinking from the margins to the center while eliminating boundaries of division that privilege dominant forms of knowledge building. Boundaries that mark who can be known and what can be known. In addition, Palestinian feminist scholar Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian taught us that when studying community under ongoing settler colonial violence, we need to look thoroughly at the intimate, at the everydayness of suffering, and at the epistemology of details. Indeed, examining the details of the voices of Abu Fadi and Abu Nasser tell us about the struggling and the stammering which fathers experience under ongoing settler colonial reality, which all a sign of the complexity of fathering in settler colonial dispossession. The fear for their family's safety and the burden of protecting them while facing ongoing colonial violence and dismemberment led them to create new logics that contradicts with the normal logic as a protecting, loving, and caring fathers. The new logic seems to incorporate cruelty and malice into fathering, but for Palestinian fathers who were at loss for ways to protect their families from physical and emotional wounds, it is precisely out of the heat of care and love that the new logic arises of protecting their family by deceiving their feelings of sadness, helplessness, and fear. To survive their unfathering, they create new modes of protecting, loving, and caring, all to keep fathering amidst dispossession. These new understandings on fathering and fatherhood in militarized violent context suggest that in militarized context, examining fatherhood requires careful scrutiny whose disclosure enables the emergence of new anti-hegemonic and decolonial theorization about fathering and fatherhood. Abu Hani and Abu Thamer, two Palestinian fathers whose sons were shot and killed by the Israeli police, were prevented from taking from their sons' bodies. Months later, after a tiring struggle for the release of their sons, the two fathers finally got approval to bury their sons at the same time, but in separate locations in occupied East Jerusalem. Although the cruelty of this reality, and despite the suffering of the fathers and their families, the two fathers who had supported each other in their struggle agreed that they would not accept to receive their sons' bodies if they were frozen. They insisted in their agreement with the Israelis that the bodies be thawed in order to say farewell to and bury the bodies adequately. Nevertheless, both fathers received their sons' bodies frozen. Like glass, Abu Hani described his son's face. Accordingly, Abu Hani refused to receive the body, protesting this colonial oppression and humiliation, and in the same time dignifying the matriarch and his family. Abu Samir, on the other hand, could not bear to return his son's body to the Israelis, so he accepted to receive it and burned it directly. Abu Hani said in his interview, "I don't blame him. I am not upset with him. I can't tell him what to do. It's his son, and he knows better than anyone else. No one can take his place and feel his pain. He was not wrong. He did what he had to do. We had an agreement, and he didn't complain, but it is completely okay. I understand his position. I feel his pain. He is the father, and he knows what is best for his son." This story illustrates how fatherhood takes different directions, styles, and formations when challenged with trauma, revealing that there is no one correct mode of fathering under such necropolitical dehumanization. Rather, fatherhood is multiple and fluid, ever-changing, sometimes contested, yet well-rooted in the face of necropology and dispossession. The quest to know more about fathers' burdens, agonies, fears, frustrations, and powers, while highlighting their affects, love, and care, made fathers engage more with my questions, bringing out not only different modes of fatherhood, but also new spaces of fathering and fatherhood. Some fathers indicated to their social media posting. Accordingly, I amended my research methodologies to include analysis of social media posting. Examining fathers' social media posting revealed how fathers use cyberspace to challenge their fatherhood disposition and their son's death, as Abu Jamal, a father of matriarch, wrote in his post from social media. Maybe some friends wonder about matriarch's families. Maybe some friends wonder about matriarch's families who write about their sons and share their sons' photos daily. Is it because of the memories that refuse to leave us? Is it the endless pain? Is it the fire of yearning that cannot be extinguished? Is it the inexorability of eternal absence? Maybe it's this and that, but it is also ringing the bell so his sound doesn't fade, and throwing ripples in the pond so it does not stagnate. Isn't this our son's message, ringing bells and throwing ripples? Another matriarch's father commented the following: "Definitely, this is true." Abu Jamal explained that fathers of matriarchs write out of pain and longing, as social media is their space where they reveal their burdens and tell about their longing to their eternally absent sons, which helps to ventilate and alleviate their pain. However, Abu Jamal tells us that it's not only this, but the need to make a noise, to disrupt the cruelty of silence, so that their son or their cause never fades from public consciousness. He uses his son's story to muddy the clear water, to interrupt the routines of life under colonialism. Abu Jamal's post revealed that writing on social media is a political act to resist the fading of matriarch's son message of freedom and dignity. Writing and sharing on cyberspace is about preventing his son's death from becoming forgotten, i.e. fathering his son on cyberspace, what I wish to call e-fathering. Accordingly, activities on social media seek to interrupt their son's disposability and resist their unfathering. Fathers resist by making fatherhood flexible and elastic, so they can expand it using cyberspace, so they never stop being fathers even for dead sons. Hence, e-fathering is about creating life out of death. Other cyber posting opened up new psycho-political spaces to speak back, express pain, and make sense of wounding. Fathers posting assert the importance of recognizing contemporary cyberspace as additional space to process loss and engage with new modes of meaning-making and resistance. The post suggests that we take seriously social media posts in the context of political violence as counter-hegemonic voices that open additional theoretical and methodological approaches to understanding and dealing with the pain and loss. Studying silence communities require deconstructing dominant paradigms and dominant ways of knowledge production. We researchers need to scratch off the surface of the oppressed everydayness and live and dive into hidden spaces, meanings, and dynamics, drawing from a wide array of indicators to provide insights that explain complex experiences of the colonized. We need to research back in the sense that we need to extend our methodologies and explore new ways of knowing. Mignolo notes that the production of knowledge has been controlled by the Western Eurocentric modernity and postmodernity, which brings colonialism into the picture, although as a derivative rather than constitutive component, making coloniality and colonialism invisible. In order to decolonize our knowledge and liberate it, we need to undermine Western emancipation methods and challenge unjust research that reinforce epistemic silencing. Feminist and indigenous methodologies enable fathers' voices to push my borders of learning, reading, and knowing, suggesting that as fathers break their chains and insist on fathering in new modes and through additional spaces, we need to break our chains of dependency in knowledge production and insist on intellectual liberation that comes from the colonized perspective. Departing from this methodological approach of my doctoral research, I realized that there are many other spaces to look at and analyze fathering and fatherhood under militarization. As Abu Fadi indicated in his previous quote, prayers at Al-Aqsa Mosque was unseen space of fathering and fatherhood in occupied East Jerusalem. When studying fathering in East Jerusalem, I realized that prayers in Al-Aqsa and hanging out in the Old City and in Bab al-Amud are popular familiar routines in East Jerusalem. Knowing that these three locations are heavily militarized and under constant settler colonial attack raised the question of what are the father-child connectivity practice under militarization? How do we researchers and mental health workers read father-child relationship in militarized context? What should we look at in time, space, and context and occasions? To answer these questions, I went to pray in Al-Aqsa on Fridays. I sat in Bab al-Amud and walked the Old City Market together with my mentor, Professor Nader Shalhouk-Kevorkian, to observe together fathers and children togetherness. I was there on holidays and weekends, sometimes with my own child and when pregnant with my second child. Additionally, I interviewed fathers who take their children on daily basis and occasionally to Bab al-Amud and Al-Aqsa, as well as collecting posts from social media, including text and photos, and asking fathers about its meanings. I love to take my son with me to the market to buy supplies for my restaurant so he can learn. But if I see that the security situation is intense, I go back home. I don't want to be involved in problems because I fear for my children. This is a state of power and violence, not laws, not rights. They arrest or kill. But we need to steadfast. Our weapon is awareness and knowledge. Therefore, I explain everything to him. Months ago, my son witnessed a violent attack of the Israeli soldiers in Bab al-Amud. Now he is afraid to come with me to the Old City area. He doesn't believe that I will protect him anymore. Now my son understands what is a political situation. But our time together was hurt. He still sleeps in my lap. I take him to school. Everything is okay. But he refuses to go with me to the Old City because he is afraid. So I talk to him and I wait for him to gain courage and trust again. We live under occupation. It is our everydayness. Violence is present. It happens every day. So I prepared my children since they were young. I trained them to come home every day until everything happened with him during the day. So when my son was shot by soldiers while praying in Al-Aqsa Mosque, he was not affected psychologically. On contrary, he kept going and I started to go with him, to be with him. This is how I raise him. That it is our right. This is our land and our home. We won't leave it. If he believes in his right, he will never be afraid. Father's narration suggests that father-child activities and connectivities is a significant epistemological space precisely to provide insights that explain the complex experience of the colonized fathers. Fathers' voices reveal that under settler colonial violence, fathers' connectivity is to be active rather than passive and present rather than absent, that enable them to father by maintaining togetherness and their family safety in the face of state dismemberment and dispossession, mainly since there is no other choice but to face and challenge. Fanon argues that decolonization is an active process. He emphasizes that the colonized psychologically tragedy is to be passive, to be forced to exist only as a cog in the machine. Thus, he suggests to allow the colonized to play a part in a vertebral game of activity. In settler colonial context, Black scholars argue that decolonizing my consciousness and identity are significant in creating and agenting subjectivity rather than disavowal and imbued with the potential for recovered and refigured formations and enactments of Black identity that proclaim authentic presence. Studying connectivities of Palestinian fathers and their children in Al-Aqsa Mosque can be a controversial and politically charged subject. No one's Palestinian fathers were accused of being cruel and even terrorists by the Israeli politicians and hegemonic media. The question is how to analyze and argue fathers' narrations and bodies while countering accusations of terrorism within colonial and Islamophobic context. Indeed, in my first presentation of this research and when presenting fathers' narrations, a foreign student said that he is now convinced that the Palestinian father is a violent father. A note that made my writing, presenting, and arguing fathers' voices more complicated, raising the questions of how do we write against Western dominant notions of colonized struggle, resistance, and livability, how to maintain my ethical obligation and being faithful to fathers' voices, how to defy epistemic violence. Following Edward Said's permission to narrate and Mbembe's on post-colony, where they show how the colonized narrations are emerged and circulated under Western perspectives. Mbembe reveals how Western perspectives fabricates simulacra of reforming stereotypes. Maha Nassar, a Palestinian scholar, show how the Palestinian narrative is scrutinized and suppressed in the Western media. And Marwa Fatafta illustrates how the world has heard of Palestinians, but not for their story told in their own words. Engaging with and learning from fathers, telling their stories, looking with them at their cyberposting, being attentive to their mundane and detailed aspects of fathering in a space of fatherless community enabled me to uncover new epistemological spaces, from Al-Aqsa to Bab al-Amud to the mere father's shoulders that carries their kids, that contributed to the understandings and conceptualization of individual and cultural coping, resilience, and resistance of fathers in occupied East Jerusalem. As Mignolo explains, that we need to de-link Western and hegemonic epistemologies by unveiling the epistemic silences of Western epistemology and affirming the epistemic rights of the racially devalued and decolonial options to allow the silences to build arguments to confront those who take originality as the ultimate criterion for the final judgment. Challenging myopic knowledge and the decision to know more about fathers and fathering in occupied East Jerusalem seeks to build liberating agendas with them rather than for them. An agenda that follows Fanon's not being as a cog in the machine of knowledge production, but rather to play a part in a vertebral game of activity, specifically in our ways toward decoloniality and liberations. Our duty as Palestinian feminists is to speak silence, to voice out power and pain in spaces of disappearance. As our Palestinian fathers in Jerusalem carry their kids on their shoulders, with power and love, even if their shoulders are tired and exhausted, our feminist research should be carried with morality, love, ethics, defiance, and the power of life. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Othman. Thank you so much for what both of you all just shared. I know that there's a lot to process. I know I've been processing a lot as we've been listening. I know there's a lot of comments in the chat. I do want to just let everyone know we have some time for Q&A. So if anyone has questions for both of our guests, please feel free to put them in the chat. I also want to just give space for folks who did share comments in the chat. If you would like to share your comment also, or have us read it out loud for you, please do so. We want this to be a space where everyone is sharing personal narratives and personal thoughts as well. So I'm going to give us a second just to see if we get any questions in the chat. If not, I have one for each speaker to also start us off.
I was also going to add to what Abeer is saying, that we're going to stop the recording now, so to make folks more comfortable. And also, if you have a question